Imagine a life where your beauty was your currency, where your silence was your survival, and where one wrong glance could decide if you lived in comfort or vanished into the streets of Rome. This is not the story of emperors or gladiators. The hidden life of a male concubine in ancient Rome, trapped in the shadows of power, desired in secret, mocked in public, and forced to endure the rise and fall of an empire that saw him as both treasure and shame. His existence was a paradox. Adored at night, invisible by day, chained by luxury, yet aching for freedom, surviving through wit, silence, and the small rituals that kept him sane. And when Rome itself began to crack riots in the streets, emperors falling one after another, famine gnawing at the city, he faced the ultimate question: remain a possession until forgotten, or risk everything for a freedom that might destroy him. This is the story that history tried to bury, and tonight you'll hear it in full, raw, human, and unforgettable. Stay with me, because once you step into his world, you'll never look at Rome the same way again. It may surprise you to know that in the heart of ancient Rome, beneath the grand marble arches, the echoing Senate debates, and the endless battles sung about in triumph, there existed another story, quieter, darker, and more human than the ones polished into history books. It is the story of those whose names were never etched into stone, whose faces never gazed out from coins, and whose existence was half hidden behind curtains of silk, incense smoke, and whispered secrecy. Tonight, I want to take you into one of those lives, the life of a Roman concubine, not the idealized mistress sung of in poetry, but a male concubine trapped in a world where power and pleasure, cruelty and dependence, devotion and humiliation lived side by side. Imagine yourself now, lying back in your bed, your room dimly lit, the gentle hush of nighttime pressing in around you. Maybe there is rain against your window, or the soft hum of distant traffic, or the whisper of the air moving quietly in your home. Let this calmness draw you in. Allow your eyes to grow heavy. And before we step fully into this story, let me gently remind you to subscribe to our channel so that more of these forgotten histories can find you when the world grows still. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The echoes of history have always traveled far, from one place to another, and your presence here is another link in that long chain. Now let us step back into Rome, not the Rome of monuments, but the Rome of inner rooms, of quiet exchanges, of men owned not as slaves exactly, but not as free either. The role of a male concubine in Rome was neither openly celebrated nor entirely secret. Roman law made sharp distinctions between respectable wives, tolerated mistresses, disposable slaves, and the shadowy figures in between. The male concubine was one of those shadows, sometimes cherished, sometimes scorned, often forgotten when his youth or beauty faded. He could be a Greek boy brought over after a conquest, or the child of a household slave, or even a freeman who sold himself for survival. His life might begin in laughter, with banquets and songs, perfumed oils, and the touch of silk, but it so often ended in silence, pushed aside, his existence replaced by another. Can you picture the scene? A villa perched on one of Rome's 7 hills, mosaic floors glowing faintly in the torchlight, walls painted with mythological scenes, and there, tucked away, a chamber not meant for public eyes. In that chamber, the concubine lived. His duties were not just physical. He was expected to soothe, to flatter, to listen, to embody the role of companion without ever holding the title. Strange, isn't it, how Rome, a society so proud of its laws and order, had entire lives lived outside those very laws? One Roman poet mocked the idea that a concubiness, a kept man, could ever be taken seriously. Yet the same poet likely knew men who had them. In the markets, whispers traveled quickly. That senator keeps a boy. That general, despite his conquests, returns home to his concubine. And though the whispers might sting, no one was truly shocked. Rome was a paradox, stern in public morality, indulgent in private pleasure. Our concubine, then, lived in that tension, half ornament, half prisoner. At night, while others laughed at feasts or debated in the forum, he lingered by the atrium pool, watching the flicker of lamplight dance across the water. He might hear the cries of street sellers beyond the walls, offering bread and olives, the clatter of hooves on stone, and feel the pang of a life he could not fully live. Did he feel love? Sometimes. These men were not always unloved. There are hints in Roman writings that some masters grew deeply attached to their concubines, offering them a stability that could last for years. But such love was always conditional, tied to status, beauty, obedience. A concubine who grew too bold, who sought freedom, who demanded more, risked everything. And so, most learned to live in quiet endurance, playing their role softly, always aware that their value could dissolve, like wax in the heat. Here's a detail that is rarely told in history books. Some Roman households assigned perfumes to their concubines, unique scents meant to mark them, so that when the master caught the faintest trace, he was reminded of possession. Imagine being known not by your name, but by the smell you carried, rose, myrrh, or cinnamon, and never by choice. And yet, despite this, there were moments of small humor. Some concubines, in the safety of their own chambers, mocked the grandeur of their masters, imitating their speeches in front of each other, laughing until tears came, knowing the laughter could never leave those walls. This balance of heavy truth and fleeting relief shaped their existence. And as we linger here, in this world half lit and half hidden, I want you to drift deeper, softer, calmer, while keeping a thread of curiosity alive. Because if this was only the beginning of his life, what happened when Rome itself began to shift? When emperors rose and fell, when laws changed, when whispers turned into accusations? Would a concubine's life grow easier or more dangerous? That is where we must travel next, further into his reality, where the line between intimacy and survival blurred until it was almost invisible dot in the stillness of the Roman night. When the city's chaos had finally dimmed into the hush of distant carts, rumbling toward the markets, and the faint cries of water sellers weaving through the alleys, our concubine lay awake on a low couch covered in worn linen, his eyes tracing the patterns of the ceiling, painted with mythic gods who looked down as if mocking his confinement. Outside, torches flickered on marble courtyards, and the perfume of overripe figs left on banquet tables mixed with the sour smoke of extinguished lamps, a smell he could never quite separate from the feeling of being owned. To most Romans, he did not exist as a full person. He was a shadow, a convenience, a possession tucked behind the grandeur of public life, a whisper that hovered in corridors but was never spoken in the forum. And yet, his role was more complex than outsiders could imagine. He was not just a body for pleasure, but a confidant, a listener, a secret keeper who often knew more about his master's mind than the master's own wife or allies. Imagine the weight of that knowledge, to hear the slurred ramblings of a senator after too much wine, to be present when letters from rival families were opened, to witness tears that could never be shown in daylight. He was trusted and distrusted. In the same breath, valuable only so long as he remained silent. Silence itself became his survival, a second language spoken in the stillness of dawn when his master's breathing slowed and he could finally look at the cracked plaster walls and imagine another life. History tells us that concubinage was tolerated, even common, though wrapped in unspoken rules. Roman law did not forbid a man of status from keeping a concubine, but it forbade him from marrying one without scandal. A concubine could not bear children recognized as legitimate heirs. He could not inherit titles or estates. His place was one of suspended existence, allowed intimacy, a denied legitimacy. And yet, strangely, within that denial lay a certain, twisted form of stability. Unlike slaves, who could be sold or discarded without question, a concubine often remained in a single household for years, bound not by chains, but by the invisible knots of dependence. Some masters even registered their concubines in household records, an acknowledgement that was both a mark of possession and, in its way, a strange kind of protection. Our concubine, though, felt the thinness of this protection each time he stepped beyond the villa gates. In the streets, men could mock him, whispering sinitas, a slur spat like a curse, marking him as less than a man. Roman culture prized masculinity defined by dominance, and to be the passive partner, even in a relationship accepted by custom, was to walk the razor's edge of shame. Some concubines endured it with bowed heads, others cultivated subtle masks, carrying themselves with a poise that dared mockery to strike harder. And still others, when alone, broke into tears they could never show. Imagine the strangeness. At night, adored like a jewel, kissed as if the world depended on his presence, but in daylight, invisible or ridiculed. This duality carved his spirit into two halves, one soft and glowing, the other hardened and wary. Did he dream of freedom? Sometimes, though freedom was a puzzle of its own. Freedmen in Rome often faced poverty, ridicule, and suspicion. A concubine, freed by his master, might receive a small sum or a promise of trade, but the stigma clung to him like smoke. Many chose instead to remain, reasoning that the cage at least gave shelter, food, and the occasional warmth of genuine affection. There were also strange rituals tied to his life. Roman hosts often displayed their wealth by parading slaves and concubines at banquets. Our concubine had to move through candlelit rooms where guests lay reclined on couches, sipping wine spiced with honey and pepper. He was expected to laugh when summoned, to pour drink with a steady hand, to endure the sly comments of drunken men who saw in him both entertainment and vulnerability. Some nights he left those rooms carrying bruises hidden beneath his tunic, bruises that no one spoke of because they were considered part of the role. And yet, in softer moments, he found strange beauty. The rustle of laurel leaves brushed against his skin during festivals, the faint music of flutes drifting through the atrium at midnight, the scent of new wax poured into lamps. He found small rituals of survival, counting the patterns of tessellated tiles, humming old songs from childhood, or tracing the faint scars on his wrists left from when he had once belonged to someone harsher before this master claimed him. These little rituals tethered him to himself, reminders that beneath the role of concubine, there was still a soul observing, remembering. It is easy for us to imagine history as grand and distant, but when you listen closely, it whispers with such details that turn marble statues back into breathing bodies. Some historians note that emperors themselves blurred these boundaries. Stories tell of Nero dressing young men in bridal veils, parading them in mock weddings that shocked the senators but delighted the crowds. If emperors could flaunt such things, what must it have felt like for the concubine of a lesser man, living always in fear of exposure, yet seeing the most powerful in Rome indulge publicly? The paradox must have been dizzying. What was shame in one villa could be spectacle in another. And as he lay in bed, drifting between waking and dreaming, perhaps he wondered if he too would someday be cast into such a spectacle, or if he would be discarded before that chance arrived. His life was a thread in a tapestry too large for him to see, and yet without threads like his, Rome's tapestry would have been incomplete. Perhaps that is why, centuries later, faint references to concubines linger in dusty texts, half hidden in legal debates or satirical verses, proof that they were both everywhere and nowhere. As you drift now in your own stillness, imagine his eyes closing, the sounds of Rome lulling him into uneasy rest, never knowing if tomorrow would bring tenderness or cruelty, constancy or abandonment. And let that question linger softly in your mind. What happened when youth began to fade, when the beauty that had once been currency could no longer pay the cost of survival? That is where our story must turn next, into the twilight of his role, where survival itself became a more fragile, haunting art dot. As the seasons turned in Rome, and the olive trees outside the villa bent with the weight of ripening fruit, our concubine began to notice the subtle betrayals of time, the tiny signs that his youth, the coin that had purchased his place in this strange hierarchy, was slowly being spent. A line near the eye that had not been there before, a certain heaviness in the morning when rising from the couch, the way his laughter no longer carried the same effortless brightness that once drew glances in candlelit rooms. These were small, almost invisible shifts, but in a world where beauty was his shield, each one felt like the cracking of fragile armor. Rome itself was merciless in its obsession with youth, its poets endlessly praising the softness of young skin, the glow of unwrinkled faces, the freshness of bodies untouched by age. For a concubine, time was not merely a natural process, but a looming threat, the slow erosion of worth that could not be halted by prayer or by any offering to the gods. Imagine lying in your chamber, the ceiling above painted with fading frescoes of Venus, the goddess of love, her eternal beauty frozen in pigment, and feeling the sting of comparison. She would never fade, but you would. Outside, Rome bustled with its relentless rhythm vendors shouting in the forum, magistrates passing judgments, gladiators sharpening their weapons for spectacles that promised blood and fleeting fame. Yet inside these quiet walls, the struggle was not for victory, but for continued belonging. As his master's gaze grew more distracted, lingering on newer faces at the baths or among the servants, our concubine found himself balancing between anxious devotion and hidden resentment. He would rub perfumed oils into his skin longer than before, arrange his hair with careful precision, smile with practiced warmth, even when exhaustion clawed at his chest, all to maintain the illusion that he was still the same boy once desired. There was a cruel irony in this. The more effort he poured into preserving the image of youth, the more it reminded him of its slipping away. History tells us that many concubines in Rome faced this quiet decline. Some replaced without ceremony, sent back into the household ranks as attendants. Their roles shifted from intimate companion to silent servant. Others were dismissed entirely, given a few coins or a tunic, and left to wander the city where whispers of their past clung like shadows. Yet there were rare, unusual cases where affection outlasted youth, where masters, bound by something deeper than desire, kept their concubines beside them into old age, not as ornaments, but as familiar presences, like a favorite chair or a well-worn cloak, comforting in their constancy. Our concubine, however, lived in uncertainty, caught between fear and hope. At night, he sometimes crept to the peristyle garden, where moonlight silvered the columns, and the trickling of a small fountain soothed his mind. There, hidden among the laurel bushes, he could almost pretend he was free, that the air belonged to him and not to someone else's command. He would whisper to the night, telling fragments of his story to no one, as if hoping the gods might hear. Did Jupiter or Venus ever listen? Did they laugh at the plight of mortals who begged for what the gods themselves never lacked? Freedom, power, self-determination? Or perhaps, in some unseen way, they wept with him. There was a strange dignity in how concubines navigated these fading years. Many became invisible, cultivating silence so perfect that it blended with the architecture itself. Roman satirists mocked them, saying a concubine past his prime was as useless as last year's garland. Yet those words revealed more about Rome's cruelty than about the worth of the man discarded. And yet, within this cruelty, there were moments of gentle humor too, almost absurd. Some concubines, realizing their fading appeal, would exaggerate their own decline in private jokes with younger companions, puffing out their stomachs, imitating the waddling gait of old senators, making others laugh until tears flowed. In laughter, they reclaimed a fragment of agency, even if fleeting. Still, beneath the humor, a heavier truth pressed down, the knowledge that his survival depended on remaining wanted. Each day carried a soft tension, like the tightening of a bowstring, as he wondered when it might finally snap. The city itself mirrored his anxiety. Rome was a place of constant replacement, consuls replaced yearly, emperors rising and falling by sword or poison, temples torn down and rebuilt, slaves exchanged like livestock. Nothing remained forever, and so why should he? This thought haunted him during feasts, when he stood at his master's side, pouring wine into goblets, the laughter of guests filling the triclinium, their jeweled fingers plucking grapes from trays of silver. He watched the flicker of desire move across faces, always seeking novelty, never content with constancy, and he felt the chill of being a candle already half burned. Imagine that sensation, to stand amid abundance, surrounded by golden cups and roasted meats, yet feel poorer than the beggar who sleeps openly on the temple steps. And yet, paradoxically, there was also a strange intimacy in decline. With age came a certain invisibility that allowed him to observe more freely. No longer the centerpiece of desire, he could linger in corners, overhear secrets, watch power shift like sand. His value might have been fading in one sense, but in another, he became the silent archive of his master's life. Perhaps that was his truest role. All along, not lover, not ornament, but witness. Witness to a man's triumphs and failures, to his public mask and private fears, to the Rome that pulsed behind closed doors. And as he lay again at night, listening to the distant howl of dogs across the hills, he asked himself softly, this witnessing enough to make his life meaningful? Or would he vanish like so many others, leaving only a faint trace in someone else's memory? As you rest now, drifting deeper into the calm of this telling, let that question linger like the faint scent of incense after the flame has gone out. Because in the next chapter of his story, the answer will not come gently. It will arrive through the shifting tides of empire itself, when laws, masters, and fates turned, and a concubine's life could change, not by choice, but by the storms of history moving around him. The empire was never still, and as the decades moved, our concubine's life became bound to the shifting rhythms of Roman politics. Like a small boat tossed in waters stirred by storms he could never control. New emperors rose to power with proclamations of morality, promising to restore dignity to Roman life, while others indulged their excesses so openly that poets barely needed satire to mock them. These changes rippled down into the villas, into the lives of men like him, because the private indulgences of the powerful always set the tone for what was tolerated in the city. Under Augustus, laws had tried to curb adultery and emphasize family honor, casting shadows on arrangements that had long existed in silence, though they were never fully extinguished. Later emperors, however, stretched those shadows into the strange theater of Rome itself. Caligula, flaunting relationships that scandalized senators. Nero staging public weddings with young men dressed as brides. For a concubine in an ordinary household, this contradiction was dizzying. One day the whispers of law made his presence feel dangerous. The next day the emperor himself mocked the law by turning private pleasure into spectacle. Our concubine, living in the quiet chambers of a senator's villa, felt the tremors of these shifts, as if they were earthquakes rumbling far beneath his feet. Some nights his master grew nervous, dismissing him quickly, afraid of gossip. Other nights, emboldened by imperial example, his master displayed him more openly, drawing him closer at feasts, even daring to let a hand linger too long before guests who pretended not to notice. This constant oscillation left him weary, always braced for change, always unsure whether tomorrow would bring indulgence or rejection. He became adept at reading the subtle cues, the tone of his master's voice, the tension in a dinner conversation, the raised eyebrow of a visiting magistrate, and adjusting himself like a chameleon to whatever the moment demanded. Outside, a villa, Rome churned with spectacle and brutality. Gladiators fought under the burning sun while crowds roared, chariots thundered through the Circus Maximus, and public executions served as both warning and entertainment. From the safety of shadowed colonnades, our concubine sometimes watched, feeling both apart from and connected to this theater. He, too, lived in a spectacle, though his arena was private. His battles fought not with sword and shield, but with silence and charm, endurance and restraint. History notes that during the reign of Domitian, morality again became a weapon, with philosophers exiled and whispers of deviance punished. Imagine the fear this sent into households, masters hiding their indulgences, concubines retreating, deeper into secrecy, as if their very presence might invite suspicion. Our concubine began to feel like a ghost, slipping between rooms quietly, his existence known only to those within the villa walls. Yet paradoxically, in those moments of danger, he also felt a strange intimacy, as though secrecy bound him and his master together more tightly than before. Still, he could not ignore the fragility of it all. Rome was not kind to those who fell out of favor. He heard stories of other concubines dismissed, some beaten, some forced into marriages with slaves to erase scandal. He knew that his survival was less about love and more about timing, about remaining useful until the tides shifted again. And yet, within all this, there were sparks of humanity, moments that gave his life color. He remembered the Saturnalia festivals, when roles were inverted, and even slaves mocked their masters. In those days, he could laugh more freely, slipping jokes into the air without fear. He remembered the taste of warm honey cakes passed to him in the kitchen, when the household bustled with preparations, small gifts of sweetness that reminded him life held joy beyond duty. He remembered standing on the balcony of the villa one evening as the sun set, painting the Tiber in molten gold, and for a moment, breathing as if the city belonged to him. These fragments stitched his existence together, proof that even in the shadows, one could still live, still feel. But the weight of history pressed on. The empire expanded, wars drained its coffers, and decadence gave way to paranoia. Emperors demanded loyalty above all, and whispers of betrayal could cost a man his life. Our concubine understood that he was always a whisper away from disappearance himself. Did this realization break him? Not entirely. If anything, it sharpened his awareness, deepened his ability to read the hidden patterns of power. He became, in a quiet way, a student of Rome, not of its monuments or its victories, but of its human currents, the way desire and fear shaped decisions more than laws ever did. And as he lay again in his chamber, listening to the soft splash of the atrium fountain, he could not help but wonder, what would happen when the empire itself began to decay, when the certainty of Rome crumbled, as surely as youth fades from a face? Would concubines vanish with the empire's confidence, or would they adapt, lingering like shadows even in ruins? That question, hovering on the edge of tomorrow, is where we must drift next, into a Rome beginning to fracture, and into a life lived at the mercy of an empire learning too late. At even power ages, the years turned as Rome itself began to crack beneath the weight of its own ambition. And our concubine, still breathing within the painted walls of a senator's villa, found his life bending in rhythm with the fractures of empire. Civil wars flared like sudden storms, generals marching against generals, loyalty shifting as swiftly as banners in the wind. For men like him, battles were not fought on open fields, but in the hidden chambers of uncertainty, where every change of leadership threatened to upend the fragile arrangement that defined his survival. He learned quickly that wars fought at the edges of the empire echoed loudly in private households. A master who once returned triumphant from campaign might now sit at dinner grim-faced, fearful of confiscation or exile. And in those moments, the concubine's role shifted too, from ornament of pleasure to silent balm, an ear to absorb worries that could not be spoken in public. Imagine the scene, a senator seated in the triclinium, food untouched, the laughter of guests drowned beneath the heavy silence of political dread, and beside him, the concubine pouring wine with steady hands, his very presence a thread of continuity in a world unraveling. Yet he too felt the unraveling inside himself, for he knew that loyalty to his master bound him to the same fate. Should the senator fall, he would be dragged down with him, dismissed at best, enslaved again at worst. It was in this age of cracks and shadows that his life became marked by an eerie duality, the empire teetering outside, and within the villa, the strange intimacy of a role that was both degrading and sustaining. He became attuned to every sound that drifted over the city, a clash of hooves on stone when soldiers marched through the streets, the faint cry of sellers hawking stale bread at dawn, the roar of distant crowds as yet another emperor was, proclaimed or executed. Each sound pressed against his chest, like a reminder that his life, though lived in shadows, was tethered to the grand machinery of Rome itself. Yet even amid decline, there were rituals that never died. The baths still steamed with chatter, senators still reclined at feasts, temples still smoked with sacrifice. And in all of these, the concubine remained a ghostly presence, seen and unseen, acknowledged yet denied. He remembered nights when his master, drunk with fear as much as wine, clung to him in desperation, whispering confessions that no free citizen would dare share. And in those whispers, the concubine felt his own. Worth swell, was he not, in some strange way, more trusted than the senators who feigned loyalty by day? And yet the irony gnawed at him. He could know everything, but own nothing. He could share a man's darkest thoughts, but never his name in public. As Rome cracked, so too did the mask he had worn for years, and in rare moments of solitude, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of it. Sometimes, standing in the villa garden, as dusk painted the sky in hues of violet and ash, he would stare at the withering vines clinging to the marble columns and see himself reflected there. Once vibrant, now fading, still clinging though the season had turned. There were also moments of strange, almost absurd humor, for decline never came without irony. One evening during Saturnalia, when roles were reversed and masters served their slaves, the senator placed a golden wreath on the concubine's head and jokingly called him Dominus for a night. The household roared with laughter, and even he laughed, but inside, the taste was bitter, because for one brief moment, he was treated as more than a shadow, only for the jest to vanish with dawn. Rome's decline also meant harsher realities. In the streets, food shortages grew more common. Riots sometimes erupted in marketplaces, and whispers of plague drifted through the alleys. He saw beggars clustered beneath temple steps, their hands outstretched, and though he had a roof over his head, he recognized the fragile thread separating him from them. What if tomorrow his master lost favor, or died, or simply tired of him? He could so easily join the forgotten multitudes, another nameless figure in a city that devoured its own. And yet, despite this fragility, there were still nights of beauty that clung to him like fragile pearls in the mud. He remembered standing at the villa's balcony, watching the moon hang heavy over the Tiber, its light spilling across rooftops. And for that brief stretch of silence, he felt something larger than ownership or status. He felt himself, breathing, alive, whole, if only for a moment. History tells us that concubines, like all who lived in Rome's margins, became both invisible and indispensable in times of crisis. Their presence was never written in law, but their absence would have been felt by those who leaned on them. In silence. And so he endured, his life a testament not to glory, but to survival, not to triumph, but to adaptation. Yet as Rome's fractures deepened and emperors turned more suspicious, even survival became uncertain. Would secrecy be enough to protect him, or would the empire's paranoia eventually expose lives like his, casting them into ruin? That is where our story must drift next, into the shadows of suspicion and the dangerous game of being seen too much, or not seen at all. Suspicion spread through Rome like smoke, curling into every chamber, every whispered conversation, every fleeting glance that lingered too long, and our concubine felt its weight pressing on him as surely as the marble ceilings above. The empire in decline did not trust easily. Emperors, senators, generals, and even ordinary men guarded their words, for accusations could sprout like weeds from the simplest rumor, and punishment fell swift and merciless. In this climate, the concubine's life became a delicate balancing act. He had always lived in shadows. But now those shadows seemed alive, ready to swallow him should he misstep. His master, once indulgent and careless, grew more watchful, pacing the atrium late into the night, muttering about informers and rivals. And the concubine knew that in such moods he was both sanctuary and threat. He was sanctuary because he alone was allowed to hear these fears, to place a calming hand or a quiet word when others could not. But he was a threat because the very intimacy that bound him also made him dangerous. If he ever spoke, he could destroy reputations, perhaps even lives. And so his silence, once a survival tool, became a weapon in itself, though one he never wished to wield. Imagine lying awake in a dim chamber, the smell of extinguished oil lamps heavy in the air, hearing the faint clatter of sandals in the corridor, and wondering if the step belonged to a servant bearing news, or to a guard come to drag you away. This was the texture of his nights, now soaked in uncertainty, sharpened by fear, softened only by the rhythm of his own breath, which he clung to as though it were proof of his existence. Historical accounts tell us that under emperors like Domitian and later Commodus, paranoia reached fever pitch. Men were accused of treason for careless words at banquets, for gestures misinterpreted, even for dreams reported by jealous rivals. In such a world, the concubine was both invisible and highly visible. Invisible because society refused to name his place openly. Visible because proximity to power always made others stare. Some nights at feasts, he felt the eyes of other guests linger on him, their gazes heavy with judgment or envy, as though trying to decide whether he was fortunate or cursed. He would pour wine with steady hands, smile gently, and say nothing, though inside he wondered if tomorrow those same eyes would whisper his name into the wrong ear. The cruelty of suspicion extended even into small rituals. He noticed that the slaves in the household began to treat him differently, some with pity, others with hostility, for they knew that his closeness to the master made him both privileged and vulnerable, and anyone tied too closely to power in those years became a potential target. He sometimes overheard muttered prayers in the kitchen, where servants begged the household gods to protect them from the fallout of scandals, not their own, and he felt his chest tighten, knowing he was often the unspoken center of those fears. Yet even in such darkness, there were moments of strange humanity. Once, during a night of heavy rain when thunder shook the villa walls, his master confessed to him in trembling voice that he feared death not on the battlefield, but by poison from his own kin. The concubine, who had no shield but his presence, simply laid a hand on his master's trembling shoulder, and in that quiet touch was a truth history seldom records, that intimacy, even born of imbalance, could be a fragile lifeline in times when trust was otherwise impossible. And yet he also knew, with bitter clarity, that if suspicion ever turned toward him, that same hand could be struck away, and the man who leaned on him could become the man who condemned you. To endure this was to live in a perpetual twilight, never fully safe, never fully doomed, always hovering on the edge of either. Rome itself mirrored this twilight. The empire glittered in marble and gold, while rotting underneath from fear, betrayal, and excess. Our concubine felt this contradiction every time he walked through the streets. He saw triumphal arches inscribed with victories while beggars starved beneath them, temples heavy with incense while corpses lay unclaimed on alleys after riots, senators boasting of Roman virtue while secretly keeping concubines of their own behind guarded doors. He understood, more than most, that Rome was not built on laws alone, but on secrets, and he was one of those secrets embodied. To carry that weight was exhausting, yet it gave him a peculiar wisdom. He could see the city not as it pretended to be, but as it truly was, a place of masks and murmurs, of desire tangled with fear. There were nights when, sitting alone in the peristyle garden, as cicadas hummed in the warm air, he allowed himself a wry smile at the irony of it all. Emperors feared assassins, senators feared rivals, generals feared mutiny, and he, a concubine without power, feared only being forgotten or replaced. Was that not, in its way, the same fear all of Rome carried, that the glory it clung to might one day be discarded by time? As he drifted into uneasy sleep, this thought pressed into him like a whisper of prophecy, and he wondered whether his own fate and the empire's were woven together, each dependent on how long they could endure the weight of suspicion before finally breaking. And perhaps that is where our story must turn next, into the question of what endurance truly meant in a world where both men and empires lived by the fragile thread of perception, waiting to see who would vanish first into the silence of history. Endurance, in the world of our concubine, was not the loud triumph sung in Roman victory parades, nor the bloody spectacle of gladiators who survived another day in the arena. It was quieter, subtler, a craft learned in silence, perfected in shadows, measured, not by applause, but by the simple fact of waking again to another dawn. He had begun to understand that survival was not about resisting Rome's cruelty outright, but about bending within it, learning when to vanish into stillness, when to brighten with a smile, when to echo a word softly, so that his presence was felt without ever seeming to demand it. In this, he became a kind of artist, sculpting his life from fragments of acceptance and fragments of refusal, crafting a self that could endure even when the tides of suspicion, age, and shifting fortune pressed against him. To endure was to observe, and he observed everything. The rhythm of footsteps in the villa that told him whether his master's mood was heavy or light, the way servants paused their work when rumors from the forum arrived, the flicker of a senator's hand at a feast betraying nervousness behind laughter. He trained his senses like a soldier trains his weapons, not for attack, but for defense, for the subtle dance of knowing how to be present without being noticed too sharply. Rome itself, in its decline, was engaged in a similar performance. Emperors still staged games, still minted coins with their faces, still paraded through streets, all to conceal the fragility beneath, the cracks widening with every war, every famine, every betrayal. Our concubine saw the mirror clearly. His own smile at banquets was no different from the emperor's triumphal arch, both facades built to hide fear of collapse. There was, strangely, a kind of peace in that recognition, as if endurance was less about denying pain and more about embracing the truth that life itself was made of such contradictions. He began to find comfort in small rituals that gave shape to his days, tracing the outlines of mosaics with his finger, counting the swallows that darted across the evening sky, listening for the shift in the Tiber's current when storms rolled in from the mountains. These small acts were his anchor, proof that even as Rome roared and shifted, there was a rhythm deeper than power, a rhythm closer to his own breath. And within that rhythm, endurance became almost sacred. He noticed, too, the quiet endurance of others around him, the kitchen slave who hummed old songs from her village while kneading bread, the doorkeeper who rubbed a worn amulet before every visitor's arrival, the gardener who tended laurel trees even when riots thundered in the city beyond the gates. They, too, lived by endurance, each in their own way. And in recognizing this, he felt less alone. There were moments of humor that crept through as well, soft reminders that even in endurance, the absurd found its way. Once, during a feast when his master's rival boasted endlessly of his hunting skills, the concubine, pouring wine, nearly tripped and spilled a stream of it across the rival's robes. For a heartbeat, silence froze the room. Then the rival laughed, and others followed. And in that laughter, he felt a rare relief, as if even his mistakes could dissolve into shared humanity. Still, endurance had a darker side. It required swallowing moments of humiliation, accepting jokes made at his expense, listening to the casual cruelty of men who never imagined he might feel as deeply as they did. He bore it all with the same calm mask, knowing that showing offense could mean dismissal, or worse. Yet in private, when alone in his chamber, he allowed the tears to come, not as weakness, but as release, the way the Tiber floods in spring and then recedes, leaving the banks fertile again. Those tears, unseen by anyone, were part of his endurance too. History does not tell us the names of such men. It prefers to record the victories of emperors, the laws of senators, the deaths of generals. But endurance writes its own record, not in parchment or stone, but in the way a man carries himself through the years without vanishing. Our concubine was such a record, an unwritten, uncelebrated testament to how lives survived beneath the weight of power. And as he looked around him, at the empire cracking, yet still glittering, at his own life fading, yet still breathing, he began to wonder whether endurance might be the truest form of resistance of all. For in enduring, he remained when others fell. In enduring, he became a witness to what Rome tried to hide. And in enduring, he found a strange freedom, the freedom of knowing that survival itself was a kind of defiance. Still, endurance is not endless, and in the quiet of his heart, he knew that his story, like Rome's, would eventually bend toward an ending. But how? Would he fade into obscurity, unmarked, unremembered, or would he, through endurance, shape something that lingered beyond his own breath? That question, soft yet sharp, is where we must drift next into the unfolding of fate, where endurance meets consequence, and the concubine's quiet survival is tested by forces greater than silence itself. Endurance, though a skill refined in silence, was never meant to last forever without cost. And as Rome continued to fracture under its own contradictions, our concubine found that the very act of surviving began to draw its own consequences, as though fate itself had been waiting, patient and quiet, for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. The villa still stood, with its marble colonnades and painted walls, but cracks appeared even there, plaster flaking from once brilliant frescoes, fountains sputtering when aqueducts faltered, servants grumbling over rations that grew thinner with each passing season. Decline was not just outside, in the rumors of lost legions at the empire's borders, or the endless rise and fall of emperors. It was inside, at the table where bread grew harder, wine was stretched with water, and conversations grew sharper, tinged with fear. Our concubine, once valued for his presence, began to notice how his master's eyes lingered less with tenderness and more with calculation, as though wondering whether the cost of keeping him outweighed the comfort he provided. It was a shift so subtle it could not be named, but he felt it in every pause, every distracted sigh, every command spoken more curtly than before. To endure had been his armor, but now that endurance began to feel like a chain, binding him to a fate he no longer wished to carry. Yet where could he go? The city outside was no kinder. Rome, once the heart of the world, had become a place of constant unrest. Riots breaking out when grain failed to arrive. Mobs demanding bread or blood, depending on the day. To step beyond the villa gates was to step into a world that would see him either as shameful remnant of someone's indulgence or as a man without place, neither slave nor citizen, belonging nowhere. He had heard stories whispered among other servants of concubines cast out when their masters tired of them, some turning to brothels, others vanishing into obscurity, a few even throwing themselves into the Tiber when the burden of invisibility grew too great. These stories haunted him like shadows stretching longer at dusk, reminders that his endurance could only carry him so far before it met a wall. And yet, life, even in its cruelty, had a strange way of offering moments of beauty that kept him tethered. He remembered a spring morning when the air was heavy with the scent of blossoms from the nearby gardens, when he stood on the balcony and watched children playing in the street below, their laughter spilling into the air like water over stone. For a brief moment, he felt as though he, too, could be free, unburdened, simply another soul beneath the Roman sky. But the vision dissolved as quickly as it arrived, pulled back into the reality of his chamber, where the painted gods looked down with indifferent stares. The darker side of consequence revealed itself when suspicion returned to the household. Whispers that the senator had grown too close to men, that rivals might use his concubine as evidence of moral weakness, began to ripple through circles of power. Suddenly, the concubine's existence was no longer simply tolerated silence. It became a liability. He sensed it in the way servants avoided his gaze, in the way his master's hand withdrew quicker than before, in the way dinners grew colder, laughter thinner. He understood that his life hung not on affection, but on convenience. And convenience was a fragile thread in a city where reputation could mean survival. Still, even as consequence darkened his steps, he adapted with the same quiet grace that had carried him this far. He became even more invisible, moving silently through the villa, speaking only when spoken to, retreating to the edges of rooms, blending into the architecture like one of the faded frescoes. But invisibility came with its own cost. The more he disappeared, the more he felt himself dissolving, as though the very endurance that had once kept him alive was now erasing him. Imagine the weight of that realization, to know that by surviving, you were slowly ceasing to exist as anything but a shadow. Yet perhaps that was his defiance too, for in the shadow he remained, unbroken, unseen but still breathing, even as Rome itself struggled to endure the weight of its consequences. The empire was cracking, his life was cracking, and yet both still stood, trembling but not yet fallen. As he lay awake one night, listening to the distant cries of a city restless with hunger and fear, he wondered whether consequence was truly punishment or simply transformation, that perhaps, like Rome itself, he was being forced into a new form, whether he wished it or not. That question, hovering softly in the air like the smoke of a dying lamp, is where we must drift next, into the realm where endurance collides with change, and where the concubine must face what it means to be remade by forces larger than his. Own silence. Transformation rarely announces itself with clarity. It arrives like a whisper first, a subtle shift in the air, a rearranging of shadows, a feeling that what once seemed solid is now dissolving into something else. And our concubine began to sense such currents moving through his own life, even as Rome itself bent toward change. He was no longer only the ornament of a senator's indulgence, no longer merely the silent companion who endured the ebb and flow of affection. He was becoming something quieter, stranger, almost spectral, half servant, half memory, a figure that drifted in rooms, yet seemed not entirely anchored to them. His master, aged now and burdened by the crumbling fortunes of Rome's senatorial class, looked at him less with desire, and more with something that hovered between dependence and guilt. as though the man could not decide whether to keep him, close, or cast him aside. The villa reflected this uncertainty too. Once vibrant with feasts and visitors, now its halls echoed with emptiness. Its fountains sputtered dry when aqueducts failed. Its mosaic floors dulled beneath dust. Rome beyond the gates was changing as well. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. Soldiers sold their loyalty to the highest bidder, and the mob in the forum grew restless, demanding bread that ships no longer always brought. Against this backdrop, the concubine found that his very role was shifting, not by choice, but by necessity. He began to care less about the fading perfection of his body, and more about the knowledge he carried, the secrets he had absorbed over years of silence, the subtle understanding of human nature that came from witnessing power, both tender and cruel in its intimacy. Where once he measured his worth by the softness of his skin or the curve of his smile, now he began to measure it by his ability to listen, to observe, to predict the moods and fears of those around him. In this strange transformation, he became, not less but more, a figure of quiet intelligence, though no law or history would recognize it. Imagine him walking through the villa garden at dusk, the laurel leaves trembling in a cooling breeze, the sky bruised purple with the promise of night, and realizing that though he had been denied freedom, he had gained a kind of sight others could never claim, the sight of how fragile power truly was, how even the mighty trembled in the dark when masks were removed. He thought often of the young concubines who replaced men like him in other villas, their laughter bright, their faces unlined, their confidence still untouched by the slow erosion of time. He did not envy them anymore. Instead, he pitied them, for he knew that their beauty would one day wither into the same uncertainty, and they had not yet learned the deeper endurance that turns survival into wisdom. His transformation was not without cost, of course. He felt himself drifting away from the person he once was, the boy who had laughed too freely, who had believed love might redeem captivity. That boy was gone, and in his place stood a man who saw the world with a calmer, sharper gaze, a man who had shed illusions the way Rome itself was shedding its marble facades to reveal the cracks beneath. And yet, in rare moments, humor still touched him, as if to remind him he was still human. Once, when his master attempted to recite verses of Virgil while drunk, stumbling over lines and confusing gods with mortals, the concubine found himself suppressing laughter so fiercely that tears welled in his eyes, and when their gazes met, for a fleeting heartbeat, they both laughed openly, not as master and possession, but as two weary souls sharing the absurdity of life. Such moments gave light to the shadows, threads of warmth woven through the tapestry of decline. Still, he could not escape the deeper question forming in him. If survival had turned into endurance, and endurance into transformation, what was the shape of the life that lay ahead? Was he to remain tethered to a fading master, to dissolve into the anonymity of forgotten concubines? Or was there some other path hidden in the ruins of empire? He did not know, but the thought unsettled and comforted him at once, for it meant he was still becoming, still shifting, still alive in a world where so many were silenced too soon. And as he lay awake in the quiet hours of the night, listening to the distant howls of dogs and the restless murmur of the city, he let the question settle in his chest like a weight he could carry. What would it mean to outlast not only his master's desire, but Rome's certainty itself? That is where our story must wander next, into the possibility of what remains when both master and empire begin to crumble, and the concubine, once defined only by others, must discover whether there is a self beyond the shadow. Collapse when it finally began to press against the villa's marble walls did not arrive with one thunderous strike, but with the slow erosion of countless small cracks, each almost invisible until they spread too wide to ignore, and our concubine, ever watchful, noticed the change before anyone spoke it aloud. His master's household, once alive with banquets, laughter, and visitors weaving in and out with flattery and schemes, grew quieter by degrees. Fewer guests came, food portions shrank, the servants' whispers turned sharp with worry, and dust lingered longer in the corners, as if even the gods had turned their faces away. The empire itself mirrored this decline. Armies lost to barbarians at the borders, treasuries drained, citizens restless in the streets, demanding bread that the state struggled to supply. For a concubine who had lived in the fragile balance of another man's desire, this external collapse became an internal tremor, shaking the very foundation of his existence. No longer did his master's hand linger with the warmth of need. Now it trembled with age, with fear of exile, with paranoia that rivals might strip him of power. In those late nights, when the senator muttered anxiously about confiscations and betrayals, the concubine was no longer merely a comfort. He was the only witness left, the one who heard the sobs muffled into a pillow, the curses spat into the silence, the half-prayers whispered toward gods who never answered. And though he offered the same quiet presence he always had, inside he felt the shift. He was not just a possession anymore, not just an ornament, but a vessel of memory, carrying within him the rise and decline of a man, a household, and an empire. Imagine the strange intimacy of such collapse, sitting in the peristyle garden, while vines strangled the columns, listening to the fountain sputter as if choking on its own decline, while beyond the walls the city roared with riots and rumors. He saw soldiers marching not in triumph, but in desperation, their armor dented, their eyes hollow. He saw markets where stalls once glittered with spices, now offering only wilted greens and stale bread. And he knew that just as Rome's glory was waning, so too was the security of the life that had bound him. Yet within this collapse, something unexpected began to flicker. A question he had long buried started to rise, soft but insistent. Who was he, apart from this role? All his years had been shaped by endurance, his worth measured by how well he pleased, how quietly he listened, how perfectly he faded into the needs of others. But now, as his master's gaze grew clouded and distracted, as servants no longer bowed to him with the same wary respect, as even his body began to betray the smoothness of youth, he wondered whether collapse might also be a kind of release. Perhaps when the structures that held him dissolved, something else might emerge. Still, the risk was immense, for Rome was not a city that welcomed those who stepped beyond their assigned roles. A concubine who sought independence could be mocked, scorned, even beaten. And yet, in the quiet of his chamber, as moonlight spilled across faded frescoes of gods frozen in eternal youth, he allowed himself to imagine a different existence, not one of triumph or wealth, but of anonymity chosen, rather than imposed, of freedom not grand but simple. He pictured walking among crowds as just another man, unremarkable, carrying bread beneath his arm, unnoticed and unowned. It was a dream both terrifying and soothing, for it meant the collapse that threatened to erase him might also carry the seed of a new self. History tells us little of such men, for their stories were not carved in stone, but hints remain in letters, where senators grumbled about former companions seeking livelihoods, in poems mocking freedmen who once were concubines, in the silence between legal codes that never quite knew how to classify them. Those fragments suggest that some did indeed slip free, carving modest lives in the cracks of Rome's decline. Our concubine, sensing collapse closing in, began to wonder whether he too might become one of those whispers in history. He walked more often to the edge of the villa's gardens, staring at the city below, breathing the smoke of hearths, listening to the cries of vendors and the wails of infants, and thinking not of endurance, but of escape. Yet fear still bound him, for freedom meant the loss of the only structure he had ever known, and collapse, though painful, at least carried the comfort of familiarity. As he drifted to sleep in those uneasy nights, he wondered which would consume him first. The collapse of Rome, the collapse of his master, or the collapse of the self he had been forced to play for so many years. And that is where our story must wander next, into the moment when collapse ceases to be background and becomes choice, when survival is no longer enough, and when the concubine must face the possibility of stepping into a life defined not by others but, for the first time, by himself. Choice, when it finally began to rise within him, did not arrive like the trumpets of a Roman triumph, nor the sudden roar of a crowd in the Circus Maximus. It arrived softly, like a whisper at the edge of his mind, a question that refused to leave. If collapse was inevitable, could he choose how to fall? For years he had endured, and endurance had become its own kind of art, shaping him into a man who could bend without breaking, who could vanish when needed and reappear with a smile when summoned. But as the villa grew quieter, as the senator's strength dwindled, and his words slurred more often with wine and fear, the concubine began to feel that endurance alone was no longer enough. Rome outside the walls had shifted beyond recognition. The forum was filled with angry mobs demanding grain. Soldiers auctioned their loyalty to rival claimants of the throne, and whispers of barbarian incursions filtered in from the northern frontiers. The very order that had once seemed eternal was fraying into threads, and in those threads, cracks appeared wide enough for someone like him to imagine slipping through. Still, the thought of choice terrified him, for he had never been taught how to choose for himself. From the moment he was taken into this life, his path had been laid out by others, the master who owned him, the culture that defined him, the silence he was forced to maintain. To choose now meant stepping into a void, a freedom as frightening as it was alluring. He would sit in the peristyle garden at twilight, the scent of wilted roses heavy in the air, and imagine walking beyond the villa gates not as property, but as a man, nameless in the crowd, invisible in a new way, not erased by servitude, but liberated by anonymity. Yet he also knew the risks. Rome was not kind to those who carried visible scars of their past, and concubines, if discovered outside the safety of a household, were often mocked, exploited, or abandoned. He feared hunger. He feared ridicule. He feared being recognized as what he once was. And yet, perhaps most deeply, he feared remaining, fading away into the dust of the villa, forgotten as his master aged and died, his own name lost before it was ever spoken. Choice, then, became not a grand declaration, but a quiet stirring, a weighing of fears. Was it better to risk freedom and suffer, or to remain safe and dissolve? History hints that many men in his position faced this same fork, though few records. Remain. Some became freedmen, earning a modest trade, their past whispered about, but tolerated. Others vanished into the shadows of brothels or taverns. A rare few, perhaps, found places in the households of kinder patrons, though kindness in Rome was never without its price. Our concubine thought of these paths as he watched the senator doze at feasts, once proud hands trembling, eyes glazed. With age, he wondered whether he owed loyalty to a man who had both kept and caged him, or whether loyalty had already been spent in the countless nights of silence he had given. Choice was no longer a distant dream. It was creeping closer each day, like ivy wrapping around the columns of the villa, impossible to stop. And with it came a strange sensation, something he had not felt in years. Anticipation. He began to notice things he had once ignored. The cracks in the villa wall that led to the street beyond, the coins carelessly dropped by visitors, the sympathetic glance of a kitchen slave who, perhaps, might help if asked. These small details wove together like a secret map, reminding him that choice was not only possible, but already waiting. Still, he hesitated, caught between fear and longing, between habit and hope. In the silence of his chamber, lying beneath faded frescoes of gods who seemed to watch with indifferent eyes. He whispered to himself words he had never dared before. What if I belonged to no one? The sound startled him, as though spoken by a stranger, yet it thrilled him too, filling his chest with a trembling heat. It was not yet freedom, but it was the beginning of claiming himself. And so the question of choice became his companion, whispering each night as Rome cracked louder around him, each day as his master grew weaker, each moment as he felt time pressing closer. Would he remain until the end, dissolving into silence? Or would he step beyond the gates and discover what it meant to live as more than a shadow? That is where our story must drift next, into the delicate edge where choice transforms into action, and the concubine must decide whether to remain, tethered to decline, or dare the uncertain path of becoming his own. Action, when it first pressed against him, did not come as a bold leap into freedom, but as small, almost invisible hesitations in his service, longer pauses when standing at the edge of the garden, his eyes lingering on the villa gates, as though they contained both danger and salvation. He had spoken choice to himself in whispers, but now the empire itself seemed to conspire in forcing him toward it. For the crumbling order of Rome left fewer walls to hide behind. His master's villa grew emptier each week. Creditors no longer arrived with smiles, but with demands. The kitchens no longer filled with abundance, but with scraps, and the great atrium, once polished for guests, echoed with silence. The senator, old now and frightened, clung more tightly to him than ever, seeking in his presence the comfort he could not find in politics or prayer. And yet this desperate dependence only deepened the concubine's restlessness. He was no longer content to be a vessel for another man's fears. He began to wonder whether he could bear the burden of his own, carried openly and alone beneath the Roman sky. Outside, the city burned with its own anxieties. Grain shortages turned markets into riots. Praetorian guards muttered about loyalty only to gold, and citizens who once boasted of Roman superiority now whispered of barbarians pressing closer to the borders. It was in this atmosphere of decline that the concubine saw his first chance. A festival day when the streets filled with chaos, masks and drunken laughter giving cover to those who wished to vanish unseen. He did not take it. Not yet fear still anchored him to the villa, to the familiarity of servitude, to the strange comfort of chains he had carried so long. But he felt the possibility like a pulse beneath his skin, a reminder that action was no longer an abstract idea, but a path waiting to be stepped upon. In the meantime, his actions turned quieter but no less meaningful. He began to set aside scraps of bread when he could, hiding them in a corner of his chamber, as though preparing for a journey he had not admitted to anyone. He lingered by the gates longer, memorizing the rhythm of guards and servants who came and went, learning the moments of least attention. He listened with sharper ears when visitors spoke of Rome's shifting streets, of districts left abandoned by the wealthy fleeing to country estates, of taverns where men disappeared into anonymity. These fragments wove into a plan, though he did not yet call it one. It was more like a story forming in his chest, a story in which he was not only the shadow, but the one who slipped beyond it. And yet action remained bound with hesitation, for he also feared what awaited him outside. He had been raised within walls, adorned for another's pleasure, trained to be silent, obedient, watchful. What use would he be in a world that required shouting in markets, bargaining for bread, defending oneself against thieves in alleys? He imagined walking through the streets, his past clinging to him like a scent others could detect, marking him as something less than man. The thought filled him with dread, even as it pulled him with longing. Still, even hesitation was a kind of action, for it showed him that the path was real, that it was only fear keeping him from stepping forward. And fear, he realized, had been his companion for so long that it no longer terrified him in the same way. It was familiar, almost manageable, like the ache of an old wound. He began to find strange humor in this realization. Once, when pouring wine for his master, he caught himself imagining the absurdity of simply walking out in the middle of a feast, leaving goblets unfilled, faces stunned, his body vanishing into the night without a word. The thought nearly made him smile, though he quickly masked it. Humor was dangerous, but it kept him sane. And as the days grew shorter and the villa's silence thickened, he knew that action was approaching, whether he was ready or not. 4. Rome itself was moving, collapsing, reshaping, and he could not remain unchanged within it. The question pressed harder each night as he lay awake listening to the city's restless murmurs. Would he find the courage to act while the chance remained? Or would hesitation bind him until the gates closed forever? That question, heavy yet tender, is where we must drift next into the fragile threshold where fear and longing wrestle, and where action, once whispered, begins to demand its moment. Breaking points rarely come as thunderclaps. They arrive in quiet increments until one day the silence itself becomes unbearable. And for our concubine, the long dance between hesitation and action finally began to tilt toward decision in ways he could not ignore. The villa had grown almost spectral now, its great halls echoing with emptiness, its marble floors cold beneath bare feet, its fountains sputtering like tired lungs. His master, frail and often incoherent with age and wine, clung to him with desperation, whispering fears of rivals, of confiscation, of the gods' punishment for sins he dared not name. And though the concubine still listened with the same soft patience, something inside him shifted. He no longer felt only pity or duty. He felt the weight of being bound to a ruin that could not be saved. Each night, as riots crackled beyond the villa walls, as the Tiber glistened with moonlight and carried away the trash of a restless city, he lay awake and asked himself, if Rome itself was collapsing, what sense was there in collapsing with it unseen? The hesitation that had bound him began to wear thin, stretched taut by the mounting tension of a city unraveling. Bread riots shook the forum, gangs prowled at night. The emperor's face on coins changed so frequently that even children mocked the minting stalls. And yet he remained in his narrow chamber, tracing cracks in the plaster as though they were maps to a world he had not entered. He noticed, too, how his invisibility was no longer protection. Servants now eyed him differently, some with suspicion, others with resentment, as though his presence had become a reminder of privilege in a household where scraps grew fewer. Once he overheard 2 slaves whisper that, if the senator fell, they would sell the concubine themselves for coin, as though he were nothing more than silverware to be bartered. That whisper chilled him more than any riot, for it showed him that hesitation had ceased to keep him safe. It was turning him into prey. And so, the breaking point drew closer, not as a single event, but as a gathering storm. He found himself lingering longer by the villa gates, his heart beating faster when they opened, memorizing the shadows of guards, the rhythm of footsteps in the alley beyond. He began to tuck away, not just scraps of bread, but small coins left careless on tables, their weight a secret in his tunic. He even dared once to speak, softly, to a kitchen slave he trusted, asking what it might take to vanish in the city. She looked at him with wide, pitying eyes and muttered that vanishing was easy surviving after was the hard part. Her words lingered with him for days, pressing on him each time he heard the city roar. Action still terrified him, yet hesitation now suffocated him, and between the two, he knew he was being pushed toward the threshold of something he could not yet name. He thought often of younger concubines he had once seen, their faces glowing with laughter, unaware of how quickly time and fortune would turn. Did they, too, reach such breaking points? Did they leap, or did they fade quietly into dust? He imagined them as ghosts wandering Rome's alleys, unrecognized, carrying stories that no one wrote down. Would he join them, or would he find a way to step beyond shadow into something truer? Humor, strangely, did not abandon him, even now. One evening, while his master rambled drunkenly about Jupiter's punishments, he caught himself imagining Jupiter himself, peering down in confusion, shaking his head at the absurdity of mortals tangled in their own webs. The thought nearly made him laugh aloud, and he swallowed it quickly. But in that near laughter was something liberating. The realization that he was not fully broken, that inside him still lived a spark unclaimed. That spark, fragile but insistent, whispered that hesitation was no longer a shield but a chain, and chains, once noticed, must eventually be broken. As the city beyond the villa walls grew louder with unrest, as torches flared and chants carried through the night air, he knew the breaking point had come. The question was no longer whether he could endure, but whether he would dare. And that is where our story must drift next, into the moment where hesitation fractures, where the concubine, pressed by fear and possibility alike, must test the first true step toward becoming more than a shadow. When the breaking point finally shifted into motion, it did not erupt with noise, but slipped into being with the soft inevitability of a tide. And for our concubine, the act of moving toward freedom began not with a dramatic escape, but with a single evening when the villa's silence weighed heavier than its walls. The senator had collapsed drunk in the triclinium, surrounded by half-eaten figs and overturned cups, and the servants, weary and disillusioned, had retreated into their corners of duty. For the first time, the concubine realized no eyes were on him. He lingered near the doorway longer than necessary, his heart thudding against his ribs, his hand brushing the cold marble frame. And in that moment the villa, once both prison and shelter, seemed suddenly fragile, like an aging shell that might crumble at a touch. Outside, Rome's streets murmured with festival chaos masks and torches, drunken laughter, the rhythmic beating of drums echoing against stone, and the noise spilled faintly through the night air as though the city itself were calling him. He did not go, not yet, but he moved closer, stepping into the atrium where the fountain sputtered weakly, then into the peristyle garden where the laurel leaves swayed in the dark breeze, until he was standing by the gate, the iron bars cold beneath his fingers. Beyond lay freedom and peril intertwined, a world that could consume him or remake him, and he felt the weight of both possibilities pressing against his chest. He thought of all the years he had endured, of laughter swallowed, of bruises hidden, of nights spent listening to confessions. He could never speak, and he realized that every act of silence had been leading him here to this threshold. Inside, the senator mumbled incoherently, dreaming perhaps of battles long past, or enemies long gone. But for the concubine, the true battle had only just begun, a battle between remaining and leaving, between the safety of familiarity and the terror of the unknown. He did not push the gate open, not that night, but he returned to it again and again in the days that followed, his fingers memorizing its cold texture, his eyes adjusting to the street beyond. He began to plan with a subtlety born of years in shadow. He tucked away more scraps, listened more closely to gossip about safe districts and dangerous ones, observed which guards drank too heavily, which alleyways emptied after dark. Even as riots flared in the forum, even as senators whispered of new emperors and old betrayals, he cultivated a quiet map in his mind, a path that could carry him from this life into another. Fear never left him, but it changed shape. It became less of a chain and more of a compass, pointing him toward where the dangers were sharpest and where they might be survivable. Humor, strange companion that it was, stayed with him too. Once, when his master drunkenly accused him of plotting with the household gods, he nearly laughed at the irony, for the thought was truer than the senator could ever imagine. Still, each step toward action carried its own sorrow. He found himself touching the mosaics in his chamber, tracing the painted gods on the walls, lingering by the fountain's edge, as though saying farewell to the fragments of beauty that had sustained him. He knew that in leaving, he would not only abandon his chains, but also the small rituals that had given him comfort, the hum of cicadas in the garden, the faint smell of olive oil lamps, the way moonlight painted the atrium floor. Freedom, he realized, was never clean. It required tearing away from even the familiar shadows. And yet he could not turn back, for the city beyond the gate grew louder each night, its chaos no longer frightening, but strangely inviting, like a voice calling him to step into the story he had not been allowed to write. As he lay awake, scraps of coin hidden beneath his mattress, he whispered to himself once more the words that had once startled him. What if I belonged to no one? This time, the words did not frighten him. They steadied him. And as dawn broke, painting the villa in pale gold, he knew that soon, very soon, he would push the gate not only with his hand, but with the weight of every year he had endured. That is where our story must drift next, into the moment when planning becomes movement, when the gate finally opens, and the concubine steps beyond the safety of shadow into the perilous promise of the world outside. The night he finally pushed. The gate opened. It was not with a shout or a flourish, but with the trembling quiet of a man who had spent years rehearsing the gesture in silence, his fingers tracing the iron bars so often that the act felt both foreign and familiar at once, like stepping into a dream long whispered but never lived. The villa lay behind him in uneasy slumber. The senator collapsed in drunken murmurs. The servants curled in corners of exhaustion, the fountain in the atrium dripping like a leaky heartbeat. And for the first time, he did not turn back to check if anyone watched. He slid through the gate with the same soft grace he had once used to pour wine. Careful, deliberate, a movement meant to pass unnoticed. Beyond, Rome opened like a labyrinth, its streets alive with the strange theater of night, torches sputtering in alleys, dogs barking in the distance, drunken revelers stumbling in masks from a festival's remnants, vendors asleep beside empty baskets, the faint echo of soldiers' sandals against stone. The air smelled of smoke, urine, and spiced wine spilled on cobblestones. And yet to him it smelled like freedom, sharp and intoxicating, even laced with danger. His heart raced, not with panic, but with a strange, giddy terror, as though the city itself had been waiting for him all these years, whispering in the background, and now it had finally opened its arms. He walked quickly at first, head down, weaving between shadows, clutching the small coins he had hidden beneath his tunic. Every sound seemed sharper, every corner alive with possibility. Was that a thief watching him, or only another shadow? Was that laughter ahead mocking, or harmless drunkenness? The city was no longer a distant hum through villa walls. It was a living body, pressing against him with breath and pulse, and he both feared and welcomed the contact. He remembered the words of the kitchen slave, that vanishing was easy, surviving after was the hard part, and he felt them now like a warning stitched into the night. Yet even so, he did not falter, for each step carried him further from invisibility, chosen by others, into anonymity, chosen by himself. He passed the baths, their steam rising ghost-like into the sky. He passed temples where priests snored at steps, once crowded with worshippers. He passed beggars curled against columns, their ragged breathing a chorus of the city's decline. He saw, too, the fragments of beauty that still clung to Rome despite its fractures. A torchlight catching the glimmer of mosaic tiles in a doorway, the faint echo of a flute drifting from a tavern, the way moonlight turned even broken statues into silhouettes of dignity. He realized then that freedom would not be grand. It would not crown him or announce itself. It would be lived in such fragments, in the ability to walk without permission, to choose his path even if it led only to hunger or obscurity. 4. The first time, He laughed softly, though no one heard. A laugh not of mockery, but of astonishment at the simple act of walking through Rome's streets without belonging to anyone but himself. Fear remained, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was fuel, sharpening his senses, teaching him to notice which streets were quieter, which faces were safer, which corners offered hiding places. He moved like a man newly born, his past clinging, but not chaining, his future trembling before him like dawn on the horizon. And as he finally paused at the edge of the forum, watching torches flicker over statues of men whose names were carved forever into stone, he whispered to himself again, steady now, "What if I belong to no one?" This time, the words did not vanish into fear. They lingered in the air like a promise. Still, he knew that stepping beyond the villa was only the beginning. Rome was a city that devoured the weak as easily as it crowned the bold, and freedom itself could be as perilous as captivity. Would he vanish into the chaos, another nameless figure in the decline of empire? Or would he carve from this uncertainty a new kind of survival? That question, sharp yet soothing, is where our story must drift next, into the uncertain dawn of his first day outside, when freedom becomes less of a dream and more of a test, pressing him to discover whether the life he has claimed can truly be lived. Dawn broke over Rome like a weary sigh, the pale light filtering through the haze of smoke that clung to the city after a night of torches and restless voices. And for the first time in years, our concubine greeted morning, not from within the painted walls of a villa, but from the stone steps of an abandoned shrine where he had sheltered through the night. He had slept little, the cold biting into his bones, every creak of wood and shuffle of footsteps pulling him awake with the fear that someone had noticed him. Yet even in exhaustion, he felt a strange exhilaration, for the world looked different. From here open, uncertain, alive, the city stirred around him with the sounds of survival. Women carrying jars of water from the fountains, merchants unpacking wilted vegetables at stalls, beggars staking their corners with outstretched hands, children chasing one another through narrow alleys before being called back to tasks by tired mothers. He blended into the flow with deliberate caution, his tunic plain, his coins hidden, his face lowered, and he realized quickly that anonymity was its own kind of shield. Here, among the endless bodies of Rome, no one cared who he had been. They cared only whether he paid, whether he stole, whether he belonged to their circle of hunger or fortune. Yet freedom, as he had suspected, came with its own sharp edge. Hunger gnawed at him by midday, for the scraps he had carried were already gone, and the smell of bread wafting from stalls was both intoxicating and cruel. He learned quickly that even the smallest transaction required boldness. To ask for bread meant to speak, to meet eyes, to risk questions. When he finally dared, the vendor barely looked at him, merely muttered a price, and for a moment the concubine felt dizzy with relief. It was that simple, to be treated as another man, to exist without explanation. But the relief faded as coins slipped from his hand, their weight disappearing too quickly, and he understood how precarious his survival would be. Still, there were moments of wonder that softened the fear. He lingered near the baths, listening to men argue loudly over politics he no longer needed to care about. He wandered past a temple where incense rose lazily into the sky, the gods watching without judgment. He paused by a bridge where the Tiber glimmered, carrying away debris from upriver, its current whispering of constancy, even as the city above faltered. For the first time, he could walk without being summoned, stop without being scolded, turn his gaze toward whatever he wished, and though it seemed ordinary to others, to him it was revelation. Yet danger pressed close too. He felt eyes on him, at times men lounging in alleys, sizing him up not as property now, but as prey, calculating whether his thin frame and distracted gaze made him worth robbing. He moved quickly in those moments, slipping into crowds, reminding himself that freedom was not safety. It was only the right to choose one's risks. By nightfall, as he found another quiet corner beneath a crumbling archway, he wrapped his arms around himself and felt both more alive and more vulnerable than ever. He realized now that freedom demanded as much vigilance as servitude had, but it also offered something servitude never could, a sense that each breath he took belonged only to him. As he closed his eyes, listening to the hum of the city settling into night, the laughter of taverns, the distant bark of dogs, the sigh of wind through narrow streets, he felt the question stir again, steadier now. Could he build a life in this anonymity, carve from the uncertainty a rhythm of his own? Or would the city's hunger swallow him before he learned how? That is where our story must drift next, into the fragile weaving of survival, where each day outside the villa tests whether freedom can become not just a moment of escape, but a life worth enduring. Survival, once a passive art practiced within the safety of walls, now became for the concubine a daily craft forged in the raw streets of Rome. And he quickly learned that freedom demanded as much calculation as servitude ever had, though the stakes were different and the rules far less clear. The city offered no guiding hand, no master's shadow to hide beneath, only the indifferent sprawl of alleys and markets, where every face was its own story and every gesture carried both risk and opportunity. He began to notice the patterns of life around him with the same sharpness he had once used to read the moods of his master, which vendors grew softer toward the poor near dusk, lowering their prices before the day's goods spoiled, which tavern corners allowed a man to linger without being asked to buy, which fountains were safest to drink from without being harassed by gangs who claimed them as territory. He found shelter where he could in shrines abandoned by priests, beneath broken statues of forgotten gods, in the cool shadowed corridors of Insulae, where families packed together so tightly they barely noticed an extra body slipping in at night. His coins dwindled, yet he discovered small ways to stretch them, sweeping a tavern floor for a crust of bread, carrying water jars for a weary woman in exchange for figs, fetching stray items for vendors who pitied his gaunt look. These acts were humiliating in their simplicity, yet each carried a strange sweetness too, for they were chosen, not demanded. He gave effort and received survival, and in that exchange he felt for the first time the dignity of action born from his own will. Rome itself, though frayed by decline, still pulsed with beauty amid the decay. He marveled at the way dawn painted the marble ruins in gold, the way laughter spilled from taverns despite famine, the way street musicians coaxed melody from reed flutes while children clapped their hands in rhythm. For years he had lived in rooms designed to impress visitors, yet here, among crumbling walls and crowded markets, he found a different kind of splendor, messy, chaotic, alive. Yet freedom was no illusion of ease. Hunger gnawed at him daily, and he felt his ribs sharpen beneath his skin. More than once, thieves prowled near, eyes glinting, and only his practiced invisibility saved him. He slipped away, melting into crowds, vanishing as he had once done in the villa's corners. He realized that his old skills, learned in captivity, now served him in freedom. Silence, watchfulness, adaptability. He carried these like weapons, though no one saw them. He also found unexpected allies in fleeting glances. An old man who left bread at a fountain each morning, muttering that it was for the gods, but looking the other way when the concubine took it. A washerwoman who scolded him loudly for idling, but slipped him a coin after, hidden in the fold of cloth. Even a tavern keeper who let him sleep near the door when storms raged, grumbling but never driving him away. These kindnesses, small and scattered, stitched together a fragile safety net, teaching him that even in decline, Rome's people carried sparks of compassion. And yet, each night as he curled into a corner, He wondered how long such survival could last. Freedom was not yet life. It was breath by breath, coin by coin, kindness by kindness. And beneath the relief of belonging to no one lingered the fear of vanishing into the city's hunger. Still, he sensed within himself a new steadiness growing, a strength forged not from being desired, but from enduring on his own terms. And as he gazed at the stars faintly visible above Rome's smoky haze, he whispered again the question that had carried him this far. What if I belonged to no one? Now the words felt less like doubt and more like a vow. Yet even vows are tested, and he knew that the city, restless and cruel, would soon demand proof of his resolve. That is where our story must drift next, into the harsher trials of survival, when chance encounters and shifting tides of empire force him to discover whether his fragile freedom can harden into something enduring. And so, as the years wore on and Rome itself staggered further into its long twilight, our concubine, once a shadow hidden within the chambers of a senator's villa, walked quietly into the anonymity he had once feared and then slowly learned to claim. He did not become a man of renown. No monuments bore his name. No poet sang of his beauty. No laws preserved his place. But in the rhythm of daily survival, he discovered something freer than recognition. He discovered the dignity of belonging to no one but himself. He lived not as a figure bound by desire or secrecy, but as one among many in the crowded streets, blending into the markets, carrying water, sweeping tavern floors, trading small tasks for bread, finding kindness in fragments and strength in invisibility. And in that invisibility, he found the strange paradox of freedom, that to be unseen was no longer erasure but protection, the space in which he could simply exist. He carried with him memories of the villa, the painted gods on the ceiling, the soft drip of fountains, the laughter that was never entirely his own. But those memories softened with time, fading into a story that belonged to someone else. Rome itself decayed around him, emperors rising and falling like flames that flickered and died. But he endured, quiet as stone, steady as breath. And in enduring, he became what so few men in his place ever could, a witness not only to the decline of empire, but to the survival of the self. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of his life. Not to have conquered or commanded, not to have been praised or remembered, but to have lived fully and quietly until the end, as proof that even in a world of chains and shadows, there are those who slip free, who vanish into the crowd and yet, in vanishing, become their own. If your eyes are heavy now, let them close with this thought lingering gently in your mind. Perhaps history forgets such lives, but the silence they carried was not empty. It was filled with endurance, with laughter half hidden, with quiet acts of survival that mattered deeply to the one who lived them. And maybe, as you drift into sleep, you can feel the echo of that life rushing against your own, a reminder that to belong to no one is not loss, but possibility, and that in the soft spaces beyond power and memory, freedom breathes.